Hey guys, what's up? Evrelia here. I would like to talk to you guys today a little bit about Warlocks in patch 5.4 and some of the latest changes we've had on the PTR, and I also want to rant a little bit about PPM trinkets, why it was a terrible idea, and why you might not be using PPM trinkets very much next patch. So originally, RPPM trinkets were designed to make gameplay a little bit more unpredictable, a little bit more difficult, so that trinket procs you actually had to think about. Now the counter argument to that, of course, is that RPPM actually makes trinkets require less thought, because rather than with the ICD style of trinkets where you had to plan ahead for when your ICD on your trinkets was going to come up and save your abilities up for that particularly, now you're just reacting to a button that lights up. So with ICD, you might save, might build up Burning Embers ready for when your ICD is up, or you might save a cooldown 10 seconds to line up with your trinket proc. With RPPM, you can't do that. It's completely random. You're reacting to it as and when it procs, and it could happen at any given moment. So even though ICD trinkets might be more predictable, it did require forward planning that is not present with RPPM. Now what's worse with RPPM is that you're completely at the mercy of RNG. The RPPM trinkets are designed so that if you have a trinket that has 1 RPPM, it means that on average you will get 1 proc per minute. Of course, this is only an average, and there is actually a lot of variance within that. And the idea is that over thousands and thousands of pulls, your average overall would equal 1 proc per minute. But because the variance is so high, and because you will never pull a boss anywhere close to that number of times, the variation between pulls can be absolutely enormous. And the worst thing is, even on top of that, is trinkets have been getting stronger and stronger and stronger, to the point where having your trinket proc and not having it proc can count for tens of thousands of DPS. You take this situation, if you have 2 Warlocks and both of them have UVLS, and one of them gets a UVLS proc on the pull and one does not, the DPS difference between them after 30, 40, 50 seconds, you're talking 70k DPS easy, no problem. And that is a huge amount of DPS to have, completely dependent on getting a trinket proc. It's enormous. In fact, it's actually so significant that what's been happening with most classes, in fact, is that shortly before pulling a boss, you will you will not DPS trash to make sure that your trinkets don't proc on the trash, and therefore you won't get a proc on the boss. And similarly, some guilds will wait extra minutes between wipes to make sure that when they pull the boss, everyone's trinkets are up, because the DPS difference is that significant. It's really huge, as I'm sure you're all aware. Now, Blizzard have actually fixed this to a point in 5.4. They've made it so that whenever you pull a boss, your trinkets will act as if they procced exactly 90 seconds ago, so you'll never be guaranteed a proc on the pull no matter when your trinket last procced in actual reality. On top of that, they've also made it so that haste will no longer scale with trinkets. Currently, the more haste you have, the more your trinket will proc. Now that's not going to happen anymore. Some trinkets will still benefit from haste, but they've made it so that most of them will not. They are increasing the base RPPM of the trinkets to reflect this, but it's nowhere near as significant as the actual loss that will be suffered. And what this means is that next patch, UVLS is going to be a lot weaker for demo than it is now. It's still going to be a decent trinket, and demo is still going to be a very strong spec, but we're probably not going to be using UVLS outside of maybe 1 or 2 fights, like council style fights, for example. It might still be strong. Other fights, it's been nerfed pretty hard. I don't really have a problem with this. I actually hated the idea that we had a spec that was not completely dependent on one trinket, but this one trinket made it phenomenally stronger than it is. The DPS gain that from having UVLS was enormous, but they fixed that. So basically, next patch, RPPM trinkets are going to be even more at risk to RNG than they are now. But the good news is Blizzard have actually seen the error of their ways to some extent, and the better trinkets next patch are actually ICD based, not RPPM based, which means you won't have to use RPPM trinket. So for other Warlock info, the patch is getting closer and closer. I expect we'll probably see it in about 3 to 4 weeks, but that's complete guess based on what I think. So between now and then, there will of course be some balance changes. I'm still expecting them to add a couple of glyphs in and to possibly fix destruction, but we've got a rough idea of where we're going to be in the pack. Currently, it looks like we're going to be playing Affliction and Demonology as our main 2 specs in Siege of Orgrimmar. Demo happens to be really good at a lot of the fights in the instance. There's lots of fights with random inconsequential AoE, which obviously Demo is very good at, just really, really good at burst AoE. As well, when you pair it with fights with high degrees of movement, Demo automatically does very well. Now, there will be some fights where Affliction can compete with Demo. Affliction does do well on AoE if it's more sustained, but the problem is on fights where you want to take on fights where there's lots of AoE, you're going to want to take the new Maloros's Fury, which is a cooldown ability that increases your AoE damage for a few seconds. The problem is, Demo can take that talent and still has a lot of mobility because most of Demo's spells are instant cast. Affliction, if you take Maloros's Fury, of course you're not going to have Kil'jaeden's Cunning, which means your movement is going to be severely impaired. Now, you can get away with it. There are some instant cast spells with Affliction, and you might be able to move during global cooldowns, play like the old days. But Demo, I don't know, Demo just fits that niche a little bit better than Affliction does. There's also the new Archimonde's Vengeance. If you haven't seen how they actually have finally decided to redesign that, it's now based on Dark Soul. What it does is it gives your Dark Soul 2 charges. Now this doesn't mean that you get twice as many Dark Souls in any fight. What it does mean is that you get 1 extra Dark Soul, because the second charge of Dark Soul won't start to regenerate until the first one is regenerated. But what this does mean is that you'll always have 1 charge available to use whilst the second one is regenerating. So what you can do is always have Dark Soul synced whenever your Amplification Trinket procs, which is the best trinket for next patch. So for fights without significant AoE and without heavy movement, you're going to be taking that Dark Soul talent. Now there are a few fights where Affliction will beat Demo, for example Nourishing springs to mind, and a lot of this is down to the new Soul Swap mechanic. For those of you who don't know how that's going to work, basically Soul Swap without using a Soul Shard will now act like the old Glyph used to, so you will copy your dots from one target and apply them to another. This won't cost you a Soul Shard, and it doesn't have a cooldown. So what you can do is, if you have one target with dots, you can quickly spread those dots to nearby targets without using any soul shards. But it is a direct copy of the dots, so it will keep the dot's strength, but it will also keep the dot duration. So if there's a agony on this guy with 20 seconds, by the time you put it to this guy, it might have 18 seconds left, and then 16, and then 15, So they're all going to have the same duration and be ticking down at the same rate. You can't just use it to keep extending your dots indefinitely. You do actually need to recast your dots at the same rate. Affliction was actually looking pretty strong for 5.4 until they nerfed Grimoire of Sacrifice again. It is still possibly stronger than it is now, it depends on your point of view. They nerfed Malefic Grasp and drained soul damage, but they buffed our dot damage. Now those two effects more or less cancel each other out on single target, and for multi-target obviously more dot damage equals more damage. However, they also buffed Haunt, and then they nerfed our multi-target shard generation. Now single target will get slightly more soul shards, it's gone up from 5 to 7%, but your corruption will only proc shards from the last corruption you applied. So having lots of corruptions out is not going to make you get more soul shards like it does now. So that is actually a huge nerf to multi-target Affliction shard generation. Now it's okay on fights where there's ads dying, because you can still drain soul, snipe the ads as they die, but what it does mean is that on council style fights, you can't just spam Soulburn Soul Swap like you used to. You're going to have to actually manually cast your dots, because you're just not going to have the soul shards to support it, and also using Soulburn Soul Swap means you're not going to have Haunt up, and Haunt is actually worth a lot more damage now than it is on live. So the playstyle is going to be different slightly. It's going to be doing more damage multi-target, but you're going to have to play differently in order to get that damage. All in all, we're in a pretty decent place for 5.4, Destruction aside. Hopefully they will buff Destruction's Emma generation like they promised. If not, you're not going to be playing Destruction next patch, so you may want to start learning Affliction and Demo.